I'm going to talk about the politics of poverty. And I'm going to, and these are the 5 things I'm going to say, so this is, you can kind of just read these things and then switch off if you like. But I'm going to talk about some of the facts that we don't know enough about. I'm going to talk about the way in which politics creates inequality. I'm going to claim that really it's not about economics, it's about politics. I'm going to talk about what we mean by wealth and the relationship between wealth and justice. I'm going to talk about the importance of getting local, which I think came out in those talks this morning, which were brilliant. And then I'm going to end just with some thoughts about what good, helpful action might look like. So, this is one of the things that really strikes me, is that a lot of the time we're just dealing with kind of myths, a whole series of myths, and there are more myths than I could possibly cover in this talk. But I wanted to talk about 5 poverty myths that are very dominant, that you hear these myths play out on the television, on the radio, in the newspapers, day after day. One of the first myths is there's no real poverty in Britain. Oh, well, it might be a bit of inequality, but you know, we're actually, most of us are incredibly wealthy, really, if we were comparing ourselves to, and then make extreme comparisons to, I don't know, the Middle Ages or Africa or something. There are lots of ways of representing poverty, and this slide perhaps is not the most helpful, but it does make a powerful point. The poorest 10% of the population in the United Kingdom, so that's 6 million people, that's not a small number of people, is it? Live on average after tax on £40 a week. That's £40 for food, for heating, for rent, for everything. And just think about that. Anybody here with any kind of reasonable, I mean, if the room's mostly full of professionals, you're not living on £40 a week, folks, right? And the really shocking thing is that group, the 6 million poorest of us, pay more tax than any other group. They pay nearly 50% of their income in tax. And I guess the key here is that, and this is what's going on a lot of the time, a lot of what we see on the surface is not the main thing. When the government talks about tax, it's always talking about income tax, but income tax isn't the most important tax for people in poverty. So the truth is there are 6 million people living on £40 a week, or that's 100, that's 10% of the population, that's 10% of families, an average of 2.5 people living on £100 a week after tax. These are all Office for National Statistics. There's nothing made up, no complicated sampling, this is just straight official statistics. And the same source of statistics tells us how we're in this extraordinary position where the poor are paying much more tax than anybody else, and that's because the poor are paying different taxes to everybody else. The most important tax for the poor is VAT, then council tax, then income tax. Interesting that income tax is even being paid by the poor, which shows that the poor are effectively being defrauded because they don't have accountants. The reason why the poor are paying income tax is people take short-term jobs, pay PAYE, and then they never get the chance to reclaim that money back, which anybody in a better salary can do. So some of these taxes are just straightforward cheats by the powerful, by government, on people in poverty. The real problem underlying this is not poverty in a kind of economic sense, but it's inequality. And inequality in this country is getting worse and worse. I have a bunch of different statistics. None of these are perfect. One of the problems with inequality is it's quite a complex thing to talk about, but it just gives you a flavour of some of the ways you can picture inequality. So this is just showing you in 1913, they're not the top 1%, but the top 0.1%. Not the 1% of the population, but a tenth of that, had 11% of national income. By 1978, that had dropped to 1.2% of national income. Still a hell of a lot if you're just 0.1, but much smaller. That now has grown to over 4%. So this is what's been going on. Again, when you look at the 10%, you can see the same kind of trajectory. Again, hopefully some of you like these kind of statistical slides. I'm trying to make them as clear as I can do, but this is a really interesting one. And it shows you how inequality has grown since 1977. The little blue box is the income of the poorest 10%, so that's just basically taken as a fixed amount. So if you took that as, how does the income of the poorest 10% compare to other groups? So can you see that it's compared to the median, that's the middle. Can you see how that started to grow in the late 80s, actually shooting up under New Labour? Actually, inequality grew significantly under New Labour, and the income of the richest 10% also shot up during the late 80s and early 90s, and hasn't really significantly changed since. A simpler way of representing this. In 1985, the poorest 10%, the average family was 3 times richer than them, and the 10% was 7 times richer. Now, in 2013, the average family is 5 times richer, and the top 10% is 13 times richer. Okay? That's basically poverty doubling in a generation. Is anybody really talking about this on the media and the newspapers that you see? I don't see it. Or maybe I'm reading the wrong things, but these things just seem to have happened without any proper conversation. There's some kind of awareness of it, but the brutal facts of it don't seem to be being hit home at all. Myth 2. Inequality is often justified because it's claimed that we need inequality to create wealth. But that's not true. This, again, rather weird looking slide, just shows you real GDP per capita. That's basically how, is the economy growing or is it shrinking? And it goes back to 1900. Actually, the main thing you can see is that the economy's gone up and down during that period in very sharp ways. It's become, in the second half of the 20th century, a little less sharp after the development of the welfare state. Inequality is not related to growth at all, actually, that slide would suggest. It certainly is, growing inequality isn't improving our economic situation at all. And this is one of the strong claims of many, both on the left and the right, that we need lots more inequality to make our economy more successful. But there's no statistical relationship at all between these things. If we do compare ourselves with our European neighbours, who we're now saying goodbye to, one of the striking things is we are the most unequal country in Europe. The most unequal country in Europe. We have pretty high employment rates, so we work very, very hard, but we are very poor. So we pulled off an amazing trick here, haven't we? You know, we're actually poor and unproductive, but hard-working and unequal. We've managed to kind of nail every bad statistic you can. I mean, if you're in Italy and Spain or Greece, you're poor, but you're not working so hard. Yeah? But we now manage to work hard and be poor. This is not smart. The other myth is somehow that the welfare state is now unaffordable. This is complete nonsense. This takes you back to the early 70s, and that little black line you can see kind of moving gently up and down is public spending as a percentage of GDP. How much of our money we give the government. Basically, you can see in a way it doesn't move very much around that line, an average of 41.7%. In fact, it's quite often above that line under Conservative rule and under that line under Labour rule, which again is not what either side tell you, interestingly. This government has been trying to push that line much further down, but even then it's still not got as low as New Labour managed to get it. One of the myths really is the confusion between public spending and welfare spending and what we spend on benefits. And this is I want to represent, this is probably one of the most complicated things to get in your head, but it's one of the most important things because you can really kill an important myth here. The myth is that the overall welfare benefit budget, I should say, which is about 180 billion, is far too big. It sounds a lot, doesn't it, when politicians say 180 billion, they say, on benefits, which huge part of which is pensions. What they never tell you is that actually almost every penny of that comes straight back in taxes. The really interesting question is, what's the net benefit? Yeah, so if I give you £10 and then take £9 straight off, I've really given you £1, haven't I? That's the net benefit. So the net cost of benefit system, the amount of money it's actually redistributing to those on lower incomes, is 22 billion, which is tiny. It's less than 2% of GDP. So when people talk about 180 billion pounds of benefits, you should look at them and say, that's before I paid my taxes, isn't it? What's the real cost after people pay the taxes? What we discover, and this is, again, one of the things nobody ever talks about, what we discover that over that period of growing inequality, three things are happening. First of all, as one of our speakers point out, wages are going down. Wages are going down relative to the mean. So there's more low wage. So you can see somebody in 1977 who in poverty, actually in 2013, less of their income is in the form of wages because the rate of pay has dropped in that period. But can you also see that that big orange block, the government quite often likes to talk about services as if it's kind of income. So we say, well, we're quite generous to the poor because we give them free healthcare or we give them free education. And then in a lot of the statistics, they count the size of the services. So if my GP has his salary doubled, which he nearly was under New Labour, then that's counted to my advantage because the cost of the GP service is now greater. Can you see that? Yeah, so if you decide to pay middle-class professionals and the better off more and more, then that's counted as to the advantage of the poorest. But it isn't, is it? If you look at the orange block, what's happened between 1977, the reason why most of the spending is roughly the same, but people are poorer, is that we spend lots more on services, much less on income redistribution. So it's like as a society we just said, we don't care about poverty and inequality anymore. That's much less important. We do care about paying middle-class professionals more, we do like those services, so we'll pay some people lots more money to provide them. Is this heresy? But that's really what's going on. So that's how you manage to square the circle of spending about the same money on the welfare state, but getting lots of people poorer, is by spending more of the money you do have on services and less on people's basic incomes. Now, another huge myth, we mentioned benefit stream, is this benefit fraud. So, I mean, again, I'm giving New Labour a hard time here, they do make me angry. This benefit thieves poster comes from the New Labour era. It wasn't the shower that we've got now. Right? These headlines are from more recently. All of those statistics that are used with those dreadful headlines were basically straight from a DWP press release, converted by the horror that is the Daily Express and the Daily Mail into those headlines. And of course we have now the wonder of Channel 4 going around trying to turn people's lives into exciting, shocking television. This graph here, benefit fraud, can you see, right down in the left, benefit fraud is so small you can't really see it, okay? Over here on the purple side, you see the gross cost of pensions, and if next to that is the total cost of all taxes avoided and evaded, 122 billion. So the real problems we have in this country about tax fraud and tax avoidance and tax evasion, benefit fraud, utterly insignificant. Yet if you actually look, and these statistics are available, on how much the media talk about benefit fraud, it's 6 times more than they talk about tax fraud. Final myth, maybe none of you fall for this one, but it's claimed that austerity is necessary, a necessary act of belt tightening because of some terrible over-expenditure by Labour. Well, actually, it was just a banking crisis created by the deregulation of the banking industry and lending to homeowners. But anyway, one of the most shocking things in 2010, our then Prime Minister, we can say that now, our then Prime Minister, David Cameron, claimed that he was going to introduce austerity, but he was going to protect the poorest, he was going to protect older people, he was going to protect disabled people. Right. At the end of the coalition period, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, very well-respected, independent body, analysed the impact of tax and benefit changes under the coalition government. The group hit hardest than any other group was the poorest 10%, losing 9% of their net income. 9%. And you remember I told you how poor that group is to begin with. Things are, in many respects, even worse if you have a disability, particularly if you have a severe disability. You find yourself hit by an array of cuts to your income, to different benefits, being made ineligible for things, or having those benefits cut. Losing 500,000 people lost social care under the last government. That's a cut of 30%. Was that in the media? Did any of you? I mean, it's a very rare day to see what's meant to be the support for the most vulnerable in the community discussed in the mainstream media. In fact, the most severe cuts were on people with severe disabilities, because they're facing the cuts that come with already being poor and the cuts in service and support. The other week, in the midst of the post-Brexit meltdown, the United Nations published a report condemning the UK government for its austerity policy, pointing out that it was in breach of human rights obligations because it had targeted the most disadvantaged for cuts. That's our government that we elect that claims that it's protecting people. Meanwhile, again, another statistic nobody ever talks about. I am nearly at the end of my statistic kind of train here. But again, it's a very interesting one, and it may be a bit hard to get our heads around. The Bank of England's about to reduce the rate of interest again. It may have already done so this morning. But one of the big impacts of the banking crisis was for mortgage rates to be slashed. The Bank of England interest rate was cut to 0.5%, and mortgage rates tracked that down. The savings of that, of course, were savings to who? Mortgage owners. And those savings are in proportion to the size of your mortgage. So this is of no advantage to you if you are poor and don't own your own house. And if you're poor and you do own your own house, it may be of a tiny advantage to you. But if you're better off, it's of great advantage to you. For the richest 10% have gained, on average, so many more than this in fact, £4,000 a year since the interest rates were cut through the money they don't have to spend on their mortgage anymore. I was being interviewed by a BBC TV journalist and trying to explain some of this to him, and going, oh yeah, oh I just put my child through university from the savings on my mortgage. Do the BBC cover these issues though? But anyway. So the truth is austerity, this idea of belt tightening, is simply a lie. What we've actually seen is a huge redistribution of pain towards the poorest and to the most disadvantaged, and of benefit to the better off and to swing voters. So poverty is political. All of these things are determined by political decisions, not economic decisions. And so one of the questions is, so what's kind of changed? How are we in this situation? Now, it's quite common and of course somewhat true to say, well, some of it's Thatcherism. My mum says it's all Mrs. Thatcher. But, you know, and there's something that definitely changed at that point, and you can see that in the statistics, in the growth of inequality. It kind of all started then. One of the other things, though, that is, which again was reflected in this banking crisis, was changes in the way in which money was created. So what's happened is progressively governments have enabled banks to lend more and more money, and banks have lent that money against housing, and of course that's encouraged house price growth, which again is an asset growth for the better off, if you can get out at least before the bubble bursts. So a lot of our economy since the early 80s has become increasingly dependent on this house price bubble. Think about it for a moment. Nothing's really changing. This is, you know, when your house doubles in value, you've not done any more hard work. Nobody's improved anything. It's just an illusion. But it's a very advantageous illusion for some, because it means they're a lot wealthier. But if you don't have a house, it's not an advantage to you, it's a huge disadvantage to you. And if the whole economy is based on this phantom house price bubble, then it's a huge disadvantage to you, because when things go wrong, it turns out you're going to pay the price for your neighbour's inflated house price. The third thing, and this might seem very extreme, but I think it is interesting. Of course, what happened very soon after this period was that the Berlin Wall fell down, and communism, in the form that we kind of imagined it, kind of collapsed. And this may seem a very cynical thing to believe, but I suppose one of the things that kept the welfare state in place was that the rich and powerful always thought, well, we had to do something to stop the poor being too angry, because they might vote for the communists. And this isn't really a kind of joke. A lot of what happened after World War II was based on the Cold War. And the Cold War, well, we won it. But we may be paying the price for winning it. Now, one of the things, a lot of the people I have a lot in common with, but I don't always agree about everything. A lot of people say, this is all neoliberalism, it's all the markets, it's all... Well, it's funny, you know, because actually a lot of the changes aren't quite like that when you really look at them. A lot of it is what I would call meritocratic tinkering. If you really believed in the market, if David Cameron and all these people were really neoliberals, they'd slash and burn public spending and leave it up to the market. But they don't. You know, Mrs. Thatcher didn't really. What they end up doing, and what New Labour ended up doing, is they like interfering with our lives. They like to take control, they like to influence, they like to nudge us and tell us how to live. And that's, I call it meritocratic tinkering. They basically believe they're better than us, they know better than us, and they know how we should live our lives. And so what's happened is increasingly a drift towards central control. This was all actually prefigured by a guy called Michael Young. I don't know if people have heard of him. He's a really interesting guy. He invented the Open University, and he wrote Labour's manifesto in 1945. He was, in many ways, one of the most important characters of the late 20th century, but again, not very well known. And he wrote this brilliant book in, I think, 1958, called The Rise of the Meritocracy. I'm just going to... It's a satire, you know, it's a joke. It's imagining a future in which the powerful believe they deserve power. Today we frankly recognise that democracy can be no more than an aspiration and have rule not so much by the people as by the cleverest people, not an aristocracy of birth, not a plutocracy of wealth, but a true meritocracy of talent. The real irony was that the word meritocracy, which Young invented, was then taken up by the new Labour government as the thing they were trying to achieve. This is a vicious irony. This is a quote from a Tory MP from the Scotsman in 2012. High-earning migrants and promising student entrepreneurs will find it easier to work in Britain as the coalition aims to ensure that only the right people are coming here. The immigration minister has said, Damien Green, a Conservative MP, said middle managers, unskilled labourers and benefit seekers would be kept out as the coalition seeks only migrants who add to the quality of life in Britain. I don't know what your initial reaction to that is in the context of immigration, but just think for a moment that that applies to you if you are in Britain. You're not immigrated, you're just like me, you've always lived here. I've been a middle manager. Am I? Any middle managers in the room? There must be a few of us, no? We add no value. You add no value. It's this crazy stuff. And yet, to characters like this just seems plausible. And the problem with the idea of meritocracy is it always brings with it the idea of the scapegoat. And we've seen a lot of this lately. And I think this is a lot of what explains what's going on. You know, if there is a pile of people who are better than us and who deserve all the money and deserve all the power, then inevitably in their shadow comes a group of people who are burdens. And some of us may be in that group, in other people's perception. You know, we've had this. What is this doing? This is generating a notion of scapegoat communities. And what is the scapegoat? It's an ancient concept of quite consciously shifting blame for your own sins onto an innocent group party. And many of you will have seen the mirroring of the Nigel Farage image with a Nazi propaganda image doing exactly the same things. As Eastern Jews, forced out by civil war in Russia and Ukraine, moved into Western Europe, they were treated to this kind of language, parasites undermining their host communities. How different is that to what we're hearing today about people fleeing wars in Syria, in Iraq? So I want to end briefly with just a few thoughts, hopeful thoughts. One of the things we need to start doing is rethinking what we mean by wealth. Many people are kind of still living under the illusion that, in a way, the law of the jungle operates. But actually, the law of the jungle makes no sense at all. The law of the jungle is kind of hell, and all societies try and escape the law of the jungle in order to be more productive. Others still are fascinated by the notion that there is some group of people, the 1% or some other group of entrepreneurs or something, who produce all the wealth, and that it might trickle down to us, perhaps in this fashion. But the medievals were much wiser than us. So this is a quote, I neither say nor maintain that kings should be called rich any more than the common folk who go through the streets on foot. For sufficiency equals wealth, and covetousness equals poverty. True wealth is part of a moral condition. And what we're seeking to achieve is a sense for everyone to feel that they have enough. And that's enough to have a life of meaning, a life of purpose, a life where you're not so busy earning a minimum wage you can't contribute to your community, as we were hearing in the report this morning. In a way, what we have to start to think about, I think, is to identify the fact that wealth is not created by people, it's created by communities. It's not created by an individual going off into the jungle, it's created by communities. who create rules and systems to enable us to support each other. And actually, the conditions of wealth creation are moral conditions that are respecting the assets and gifts, both human and natural, respecting the landscape of Bolsover and respecting the people of Bolsover. It's about using our talents with creativity and imagination to get the best out of those things. It's about having optimism. One of the things that really kills economies is when people don't believe in each other and don't believe in their capacity to make things better. And it's about having faith that we will be secure, that we will be okay, and having systems of social justice that protect us and share resources out fairly. And all of this is, in a sense, has to be done in a public square. And you might recognise that what I'm doing here is going back to that image at the front of something we're all very familiar with. It may seem a ludicrous metaphor, but it's the game of Monopoly. The game of Monopoly was invented by an American who wanted to explain to people how bad capitalism was. I think we don't remember that when we're playing it and desperately trying to win it. But what you notice in the game of Monopoly, for instance, is that to get the game going even more than a few turns, because inevitably somebody very quickly gets hold of the property and gets very quickly can squeeze you. Everybody's given £200 as you pass go. And for me, this is a good way of understanding how we need to move and reform the welfare state. One of the things we'll need to do is create systems like basic income, which mean that when you do earn money, you're not penalised for earning money because you've got a secure base to start with. Now, the other dimension, as well as thinking about this ethically, we need to think about this locally. There is another problem, I think, that's crept in to our sense of the welfare state, and that is that we kind of thought the welfare state was the solution. It was the solution that was dreamt of in 1945 for very many similar problems. But we can feel now that very often people's experience of the welfare state has become very negative. And this is not just, as it were, Tory rhetoric. It was in the talk of a council that doesn't care. A council where it seems to be nobody's job to say, actually, you've got housing rights and you don't have to live in a van for 2.5 years, yeah? These are things that's an experience that's very real for people. So part of the reason why I think the welfare state is in trouble is its own systems are not really adequate for the job. For many people, the welfare state is simply experienced as a huge bureaucratic monstrosity. Whether it be the crazy benefit forms that the DWP hangs out, or whether it be the mysteries of council, or whether it be the ever-changing structural forms of the NHS. Yes, these things are not things that ordinary people in their ordinary lives can ever get a chance of making sense of, because for one thing, the bureaucrats in the middle of them, and I've been in that role, can't make sense of them either. They're an ever-changing craziness. And so no wonder most people just experience them as kind of basically unhelpful obstacles. My favourite philosopher is called Hannah Arendt, who's a German Jew who wrote a lot about the Holocaust. She's talking about the problem with charity. But for charity here you could read basically the way the welfare state works at the moment, I think, is state-sponsored charity. Charity is not solidarity. It usually helps only isolated individuals with no overall plan, and that is why in the end it is not productive. Charity divides the people into those who give and those who receive. I think if you put the word welfare state in the middle of that, in today's understanding, that would be how it's experienced. So poverty is personal and poverty is local. The local dimension of austerity, for instance, I picked these because I put Bolsover in. Bolsover, as a community, through austerity, is going to lose £527 per person by 2021. But you're not the worst off Blackpool, Birmingham, Barnsley, Bolton are all worse off. Slightly better off Barnet, Bromley, Bath, Basingstoke. There is a pattern there, folks. And we also have to recognise that behind this are decades of injustice. I can't do justice to some of this, but one of the things that's going on in the welfare state is a huge theft by London of our money. This is Barnsley's economy. Barnsley, actually, is missing nearly £1 billion. If you just took public sector spending and divide it by head of population and then multiply it by the population of Barnsley, yeah, do you know what I mean? Just take all that public money and say, well, what's Barnsley's share? You'd have expected to see 2.34 billion. What's actually spent in Barnsley is 1.44 billion. And where's the money? Down south. Sorry to be all northern about this, but that is what's going on. The answer here is not to abandon the welfare state. We need the welfare state, but we need to really rethink, redesign, re-own the welfare state. And what that means, I think, is ultimately a much more local welfare state. Much of what we need to see change, again, it was in the film and it was in the report, are things that only local people can do, but local people also need to not be so poor that they don't even have the time to contribute to their own communities. So we need to see a whole series of changes, and these are things that as a society we can do. They're easily affordable, but they demand change on a number of different levels. The first thing we need to do, very fundamentally, is we need to educate each other about what's really going on. One of the problems at the moment is we're just exchanging one lie for another, one scapegoat group for another, and that won't get us out of this problem. The second thing we need to do is organise locally. If you think that another Whitehall initiative is going to be what saves Bolsover, you're joking. The third thing we need to do is get political. If you're not engaged with politicians, if you're not talking to politicians, if you're not part of the political system, then don't expect politicians to care about you. They'll only care about the people who care about them. That's how the system works. And lastly, we have to start thinking very differently about our whole democratic and political system. And I talk about this in terms of constitutional change. But constitutional change is not just having a written constitution, that may not even be essential. But it is about, part of the reason we're in this situation is, let's look at the House of Lords. Yeah? A body where politicians appoint ex-politicians. Is this a grown-up institution that's going to protect the rights of people in Bolsover? Let's look at the state of local government, the weakest part of the whole welfare state. Local government has been savaged by cuts, and local people have next to no control over what goes on in their local community. These are things we can do something about. These are all solvable problems. But it will take you, me, us, to bring about necessary change. Thank you.